Hi everyone. In this tutorial, I'll show you how to create compositions, I'll show you how to import assets into your project, and I'll also show you how to add those assets to your timeline. Alright, let's get started. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do is open up my project assets folder. So this is the folder that I provide you with, and it has your asset folders already in it, and it has your project template here. You just have to change the name. So these folders are where you're going to store all of your assets. Be sure to keep them in here because when you send this to me, anything that's not in here isn't going to show up. And I'll show you later what that looks like. Okay, so it's pretty self-explanatory. Audio, you put all of your sound effects and any music you have. In the graphics folder, I've provided you with some studio graphics, and this is where you can also put in any of your Illustrator graphics that you want to use if you plan on using any, because you can always make your own logo too. I've got my images in here, and I'll show you how to open up some different types of images, like a Photoshop file with layers, and also how to open a sequence of images for an animation. Okay, so to open the project, I'm just going to double click on the template here. Alright, now that that's open, the first thing I'm going to show you is how to create a composition. You're not going to need to do that because I already have one here for you. This is the one you can use, but if you want to learn how to make one, this is how to do it. Alright, so you can either go up to the top here to Composition, New Composition, or we just come down to this icon here, Create a New Composition. I'm going to click on that, and then it's going to give you some options here. I'll just change the name of my composition. So you have different options here, and these all mean different things. So this is an HD comp at 1080, so that's the screen ratio, and then at 24 frames per second. So I'm going to select that one. So the height is 1080 by 1920. We have square pixels, but you could adjust that here. I'm just going to leave those on square. We can adjust the frame rate here. So we're going to be doing it at 24 frames per second, but you have a lot of different options here. Here's where you can adjust your resolution. I'm going to just leave it at full. And then our start time code, we want it to start at 0. And then our duration here. So the first set of numbers are frames, then seconds, then minutes, then hours. So since we're doing this at 24 frames per second, that number right there is going to be your frames. So once you hit 24 frames, the second right here will change. I'll just leave this at 20 seconds, and then you can put in however long you want it in here. And you can also come back in and change that later. All right, then I'm just going to hit OK, and that creates a new composition. And then you can just click between the two, and that's opening each one in the viewer here. You can come in later and change your settings here, and that just opens up that same window. You can also copy and paste your compositions by just going up to Edit, Copy, Edit, Paste. Or you can just use the shortcuts Control-C and Control-V or Command on a Mac. I'm just going to delete those two by hitting my Delete key. And now I'll show you how to import assets. So there are a few different ways we can do it. We can come up to the top and do File, Import, File, and I'll just click that. And then I'm just going to go back to my folders here. So I want to open my audio. I'm just going to double click on that, select the one I want to open, and then import as. Right now I only have one option for footage, but depending on what we're opening, this might give us some different options. You have an option here to create a composition when you import it, and what that's going to do is automatically put this into its own composition, but I'm going to leave that off. And then I'm just going to hit import. So anything we import is going to show up here in our project bin. If you double click on it, it's going to show up in the viewer here, just as footage. It's an audio clip, so we don't see anything, but you can scrub through it here. So this is a way to view it without actually having it in your composition. And then to get back to the composition, you just click over here. So now that I have my audio in, I just want to drag it into the correct folder. So I'm just going to drag it and drop it in there. And then you can open these and collapse them to see the contents. Okay, so I'll import some more assets. Instead of going up through File, I'm going to right click in here, and then I'll go to Import, File. I'm going to go back over, and I'll import some graphics now. You can import multiple files by holding down Control or Command, and then just selecting the ones you want to open. This is still set to footage because we don't have any other options for these. We don't want to check multiple sequences for this, or create a composition. I just want to import these as is, and I'll just hit import. And now I have multiple files in here. You'll notice here under import, I'll have an option for multiple files, and I can do that if I have files that aren't in the same folder. So I can click one here, I can hit import. It's going to open it again, and I can just go back. And then this way I can go through and just import as many as I want. And then when I'm done, I just hit done. But if you have multiple ones in the same folder, you can just do them all at once by highlighting the ones. If you double click on it, it's going to show up in here. And like I mentioned in the previous tutorial, this is the transparency. So if you don't see something, this is a black logo, so we don't see it. It's just over that black background. Okay, I'm going to take all of these graphics and just drop them into my graphics folder. And you can also import by just dragging and dropping. So if I click on my images, I can just select the ones I want to bring in. And I'm just going to drag them over, drag them into the project bin here, and then just let go. And they're all going to load in here. So this is usually how I import my files. I'm just going to highlight those and drop them in my images folder. And I'll just quickly grab these video files and drop them over as well. And then I'm going to take those and I'll put them in my video folder. You can also import your Illustrator and Photoshop files directly into After Effects, which is really great because it gives you the option to have all of those layers separate, so you can work with all of those layers that you created earlier in another program in After Effects. And I'll show you how to do that. So I'm just going to right click, I'll go to Import File. So with my Illustrator graphics selected, I have some options now under Import As. We can import it as footage, which is going to merge all of those layers together as one single layer, or as a composition, which will have all of those layers separately. But you don't have to select it from here. Once I hit import, it's going to give me these options again. So I'll hit import, and now I can import it as a composition or as footage. I'll show you how it imports both as footage and as a composition. So I'll do footage first. It's going to merge the layers, or you could choose which layers you want to merge. And I'll just hit OK. Alright, so I imported my graphic as footage. Now all of those layers I had in there are combined into just one image. I'll show you now what happens when you import it as a composition. So now instead of footage, I'm going to select composition, and I'll hit OK. So now what that did was that created a composition here. So I have my original one, and then I have this new one here. It automatically names it with my file name. And then along with this composition, I also have this new folder here that it created that has all of my layers in it. But if I just double click on my composition here that it made, all those layers are in here. I'm just going to click Fit on here. So now that I brought that in as a composition, I have all of my layers in here that I created in Illustrator. And I can work with all of those separately now. Alright, I'm just going to delete those. And I'll also delete this one here. I'm just hitting my delete key, but you can also just hit the trash can right there. Okay, now I'll bring in a Photoshop file, which works similarly to the Illustrator files. Alright, I'll just select my file that I have named Doodle, and I'll just leave these as is for now, and I'll hit import. Now I can import it as footage, which again will make it just one merged layer, or I can bring it in as a composition. So I have it as composition, editable layer styles, so that's going to give me all of my layers separately and let me edit them. I'll hit OK, and now I have a composition named Doodle, and just like with the other one, I have my layers all in here. So if I double click on here, and I'll just fit this in. It's a pretty big file, so it takes a while to load at full. Okay, like with Illustrator, it made all of my layers now into its own layer in here. But what the difference is, since I had all of my layers in different folders in Photoshop, it took each of those folders and made that into a composition. So I have my balloon here. In Photoshop, I had a folder called balloon. And then if I open up this composition, I have my layers inside of there. And those were the layers that I had in the folder in Photoshop. Might be a little confusing, but just think of it as all of your layers in Photoshop are going to come into After Effects as layers in a composition. And then you can come through and just edit these as you'd like. All right, I'm just going to delete this one. And I'll delete this Doodle Layers folder. You can also open a sequence of images, and it's going to put all of those images together as an animation. And I'll show you what I mean by that. So in my assets here, I have this render sequence. This is from a video game I was doing animation for. So from the animation program, when you render it, it's going to render out your entire animation just as still frames. So as I scroll through these, each one of these is just a still frame, but when you put them all together, it's going to be an animation. Think of it kind of like a flip book. If I were to print all of these out and flip through them, you would see that animation. So we want to do that in After Effects. So I'm going to right click, import file. So when you select one, since they're named the same, it's automatically going to assume it's a PNG sequence, and it's just a PNG sequence because that's what these images are. If they were JPEGs, it would say JPEG sequence. With just the first one highlighted and that checked, I'll hit import. So this icon looks a little different from our other imports. You can see there's a stack of images here showing that it's an image sequence. If I just double click on it in my viewer here, you can see it in here and you can scrub through it. So it took each of those images and just lined them all up together. So when I brought this in, it came in at 30 frames per second, even though the composition we're working at is 24 frames per second. So you can change that by going to Interpret Footage if you right click on it, and then going to Main. And then in here, you can change the frame rate. So I'm going to put it to 24. All right, next I just want to show you how to get things into your timeline here, into the composition, so you can start layering them and animating. So it's as simple as just dragging and dropping them in. I'm going to take my image sequence first. I'll just drag it and drop it straight in. And see, now I can click over it and scrub through it. I can also hit play. This one was actually animated at 6 frames per second. That's why it's going so fast. So if I just go into here, interpret footage, I'm going to set that to 6 and I'll hit OK. So this is a good example of what happens when you change a frame rate on something. You see that it extended it, but it didn't extend this part here. So it cuts there. That's where we had the original time, but when we added the extra time, we extended this. So what you want to do is just grab that and make it longer. And now it plays for the entire thing. So if I only wanted, say, 7 seconds of animation, I can just take my scrubber, move it to there, and then I can grab this here. You'll see those little dual arrows on the side, and just drag it to where you want it. And then I can just drag it back. If you double click on your layer, it's going to open it up in the viewer here, just like if you had double clicked on it in here, so you can get back to your composition just by clicking that. You can also make a composition out of this just by dragging it and dropping it right on the composition icon. And then down here on your timeline is where your different compositions show up. So you can have multiple ones open and then just click back and forth through them here. To delete something out of the timeline, you can just select it and hit delete, and that'll take it right out of your timeline. You can drop in multiple assets just by holding Shift to highlight them and then dropping them all in. So when I drop an image in like these, it's going to automatically make it the length of our composition. So if we were to hit play, it's just going to play over this one image that we see layered on top for 20 seconds. We can turn that one off and see the layers underneath. Now these photos are larger than our composition, so I'm just going to zoom out and you can actually see how big they are compared to this. So if I move them around in here just by selecting it, you can see where it is in the viewer. I'm just going to turn off the ones we don't see right now, and I'm going to scale this down. You can scale it quickly by just grabbing a corner, holding Shift, and scale it down to the size you want. In another tutorial, I'll show you how to do all of these transforms in here, but for now, I'm just going to scale it down that way. So in our timeline, since these are all taking up the entire space, that's all we're going to see is the one in front. You can change the duration of these by just grabbing on any side. When you see that double arrow like that, just click. Once I move it past here, when we don't see it anymore, it's going to disappear. So it's no longer on this part of the timeline. It doesn't show up till almost 10 seconds right here. So right now we're seeing this layer right below it. And then we see that. I don't know why I have this so small, so I'll just hit fit to have it fit. And again, if we make that one smaller, and we can mix them up however you want. So right now we're seeing this image in the background. That's this one right here. And then if we were to play through it, I'll actually just hit my play button. Once we get to it on here on the timeline, it's going to change to that one. And it'll change to that one. Now it's going to go back really quick and then back to that one. All right, so that's how you can drag and drop stuff into your timeline. I'll just delete that. I'll just show you now how to change the duration of this. Okay, so say I have a video in my composition. I'll just drag and drop that one in here. And it's only just over 3 seconds. I don't need all of this extra space here. So what I'm going to do, you don't want to grab this top one because again, that just zooms in on it. You want to grab this one here, this bar here. So I'm going to grab the end here and I want to get exactly right to the end here with it. So what I'm going to do is just zoom right in on it. So like with zooming in here, you can just roll your scroll wheel and zoom. You can also zoom on your timeline by holding down Alt and then scroll to zoom. If you don't hold down Alt, it'll just scroll through your layers if they go off screen here. Okay, so I want to get it right to it so I can zoom way in on it and line it up that way. Or if I hold Shift while I move it, it's going to snap it. So I could snap it to the timeline indicator or I can snap it to the end here. So that's going to be the exact length. And now I want to trim this whole composition just to be this length. And to do that, I can right click right on the bar here, and then I can do trim comp to work area. And if I do that, now it's trimmed it to the correct length. All right, I'm just going to undo that by hitting Control Z, and then I can extend this again. And I can extend this back. Now that only works for trimming it. If you want to make your composition longer, you can't stretch this beyond the timeline. So then you have to go into the composition here, right click on it, composition settings, and then I can change the duration here. So if you want to make this longer than 20 seconds for your title sequence, this is where you could do it. Change it to 30 and then just hit OK. And then if I extend it here, that changed it to 30 seconds. Okay, I just want to show you what it's going to look like if you don't have the assets in your folder when you send it to me and I try to open it. Okay, I'll open my assets folder. You see that we have this new folder here. It's the Adobe After Effects autosave. After Effects does an autosave every once in a while, and it puts it in here. But I recommend just saving your work as you go and don't rely on the autosave. Okay, so let's say that I move my flower video. I'm just going to drag it over to my desktop. Now when I go back to After Effects, you'll see this warning here that it can't find that video file. And now beside our flower time lapse, you'll see this little icon here. So this means it's missing, and if I scrub over it, that's all I'm going to see. So if you don't have your assets in the correct folders that they started in, then this will happen. So be sure that when you hand this in, all the assets you're using are in their correct folders. You're going to be handing in the entire folder, not just the After Effects file. It needs to be able to see all of these. So if you leave any of these on your desktop on your own computer, I won't be able to open them. I'm just going to get these bars here. I can move it back to the video folder and then I can reload it if I want. So I'm just going to click on it, drag it back to the correct folder. Now After Effects is still looking in that video folder for it. So if I go right click on it and then hit reload, it's going to look back in that video folder and then it'll reload it in After Effects. If for some reason I started with it in the wrong folder, if this was an image and I wanted it in my image folder, but I accidentally started it in my video folder, I can move it over, but then again, it's going to be lost. So what I want to do is replace it instead of reload it, because I want to keep it in my images folder. So I'm going to go to replace instead of reload, and I'm going to replace a file. I'll go to my images, and there it is right there. And if I import that in, then it automatically replaces it. So reload if you just move it back to the correct folder. If you want to move it to another folder, you're going to have to replace it. All right, and that's going to do it for this tutorial.